Welcome back, everyone. Today's video is an exercise in irony. I'm going to be doing a response video to show you why I don't do response videos. And so I'll be responding to Farid Responds response video to my video on the authorship and dating of the Gospel of Mark. Now, the video with Farid and Ijaz originally is about an hour long. I'm not going to go through the video chronologically and respond to everything because that would be a very, very long video. There's also not a lot of substance in their video, to be quite honest, as we'll see. And so what I've chosen to do is to go through their methodology. And so I've gone through their video and chopped up the clips and arranged them in categories. So then we can just watch all of the clips in one category and then comment on them. It will be much quicker that way. I will give you the timestamps of each clip before I play it, so you can go to the original video and check on that if you like. I think this will be a much more streamlined way to approach this response video. So let's begin. This clip starts at 4:51 in the original video.
We have no evidence that these Gospels ever circulated without an appropriate designation.
So I'll just pause again right there. We actually do have evidence. It's in Papyrus 1, and it actually does not have the title Katamathion. I can definitely say that Philip Comfort, in his New Testament text and translation commentary, he actually points out this, that the inscriptio, or the title for the Gospel of Matthew, is not there in one of our earliest manuscripts for Matthew, P.
Okay. So a couple of things to talk about here. Ijaz is referring to my quote of D.A. Carson and Douglas Moo, where they say there's no evidence that the Gospels ever circulated anonymously or without an appropriate designation. And Ijaz, in response, refers to P1, and he also refers to Philip Comfort's commentary. So let's look at P1. First, what you're seeing on your screen is the entirety of P1. This is Matthew 1:1 and Matthew 1:14, according to the label that CSNTM has given it. That's Dan Wallace's organization. So we can go to the first page and zoom in, and here we have the beginning, and you can see right up here where my mouse is that this is an alpha for page 1. Now, the assumption here is that this top margin is intact and that it has no title. And so this is what Ijaz is talking about. Look, you have no title on P1, therefore this is evidence against what Carson and Moo state. However, this is simply a dramatic overstatement of the data. As a matter of fact, titles in the ancient world came in a variety of places. Sometimes you would have what we would call a title page in front. That could be the case with a papyrus like this, where the title page was lost. Sometimes the titles appear as running headers throughout the manuscript. Sometimes they're attached on tags. This is particularly true with scrolls. Sometimes, ironically, they come at the end of the body of the text. And so titles can appear in all sorts of places, not just the top margin on a manuscript. Now, since Ijaz mentioned Dr. Philip Comfort, I gave Dr. Comfort a call and said, what do you think about this? I read Carson and Moo's quote to him. We talked about P1 and some other ancient manuscripts for a while, and he agreed that yes, it is an overstatement to take a fragmentary manuscript like P1 and extrapolate from it that P1 circulated anonymously, much less the Gospels as a whole. And so we see Ijaz here dramatically overstating his case. Now let's go to the second category I have, which is called in my folder Incomplete Engagement with My Work. And this is something that I don't appreciate too much from Ijaz and Farid. I'm going to play you clips from 249 in their video, 1308, 1454, 2826, and 2852. That's where these clips will begin. And then we'll see the way that this should have been handled later on in their video. So beginning at 249.
Unfortunately for this claim, let's just break it down step by step. It says the titles of the Gospels are by no means late products from the 2nd century. And how the author demonstrates this, and how Colin from Islam Critique does the same, is by quoting people only from the late 2nd century.
What's the significance of this specific quote? He's saying, or Papias is providing his source here, or
he's trying to argue that Papias got this information from possibly the Apostle John, who was one of the 12 with Jesus.
Right.
But Papias himself does not say that. Let's pause there again. So at the very start of this video, Colin makes the argument that the scholar he's quoting, Martin Hengel, makes the case that the Gospels did not get their titles at the end of the second century, but rather somewhere between the year 69 and the year 100 within the first century CE. I want to point out here that this contradicts something he quoted earlier. So earlier he argues, in spite of the ambiguity of which John wrote the Gospel of John and which John Papias got the tradition from, here he reverses it. Here is the reasoning he's using. If there's more than one John, or we can just attribute it to the earlier one, and if there's one Mark, then it doesn't matter if there were any other Marks that were not as well known. It's still that just that one person.
Okay, so we have two categories of things here. One is the authorship of Mark, which is, of course, what the video is about, and the other thing is the identification of John. Now, my problem with the way they presented my material is this. I have a significant amount of information and various arguments in my introduction video to the series that they're responding to, and I even reference the intro video in my video on Mark, and they don't include any of this data in their response. Now, my problem is that Farid presents my case as if it is one line of evidence, as if I'm only relying on early church tradition, when in fact, I've presented arguments in the introduction video for Greek syntax, for practical evidence, practical concerns with the way the titles were regarded in the second century, as well as from early manuscripts themselves. So my argument is not just one dimension, it's actually multiple dimensions, and they're presenting my arguments to their audience as if I only have one argument, one line of evidence, early church tradition. And so the same thing occurs with John. I saved my material for the identification of John, guess what? For my video on the Gospel of John. And yet Ijaz here, once again, attacks my identification of John by saying I simply assume which one it is. That's actually not correct. Rather, I save that analysis for the Gospel of John video itself. Now, how should this have been handled? This is 45-48 in their video.
So his argument is that Peter is mentioned first and potentially last. This is wrong. We actually don't know how the Gospel of Mark actually ends. We have in the manuscript tradition roughly 5 endings.
He has another video on that. I think we should get to that some other time.
And so what Farid did there is correct. Hey, I have more material on that somewhere else. We'll talk about that later. What they should have done is made it known to their audience that I have more material relevant to the authorship of the Gospel of Mark as well as the identification of John. They should have made that known to their audience instead of presenting part of my arguments as if they were the whole of my argument, and that's not the case. So it's unfortunate that's how that was handled. Let's move on to a glaring non sequitur with the issue of Rebecca. So this is going to start at 12:20 in their video.
On the age of Rebecca, he looked at what the scholars had interpreted and said we can dismiss this assumption and that assumption. So following through using his own methodology, these are just layered assumptions, and we don't actually know which John is being referred to.
And this clip is 40:16 in their video.
But remember, we're using Collins' method here because he says that assumptions need to be removed and we need to read the thing as it actually exists. Remember, that's his video from the age of Rebecca.
What we have here is a glaring non sequitur. The argument seems to be you reject rabbinic tradition, and specifically he's referring to times I've singled out rabbis that simply read things into the text and act like they're part of the biblical story. I reject that, therefore I should reject early Christian history. This is absolute nonsense. They're different styles of writing, different types of writing, different genres. They have different purposes, and they should both be evaluated critically. And when you evaluate rabbinic eisegesis critically, it doesn't stand up to critical scrutiny. The rabbis are simply doing their own thing, all right? The better analogy would be, let's say I accepted the Gospel of Peter, but then I rejected rabbinic interpretation. That would be more of a similarity because the Gospel of Peter gives us information about the resurrection. Jesus comes out of the tomb, he's super tall, there's a cross following him, the cross is talking, and so forth. And so clearly, later writers have come in and inserted details. They're filling in perceived gaps in the story. And so there's a lot of similarity, actually, between the way some rabbinic tradition works and the way some of the New Testament Apocrypha works. So if I accepted one and rejected the other, it would be possible for him to draw a parallel there and say I'm being inconsistent. But it is simply a demonstrable, glaring non sequitur to say that I'm inconsistent because I reject rabbinic eisegesis, but also accept some church history. This clip begins at 31:41.
So it says, yet as we have seen, there is nothing in the New Testament that is inconsistent with Papias's claim that Mark wrote the second gospel, except for Mark, whoever the author was of the Gospel of Mark, not saying who they were. That would be the first problem, right?
Okay, so the silence of Mark on its authorship is an argument against the authorship of Mark. That is, the silence, the technical anonymity of the Gospel of Mark is inconsistent with Mark writing it. That to me sounds like an argument from silence, but listen to what he says later on in this clip.
The second problem, he says, and since we have no indication that anyone in the early church contested Papias's claim, now this is an argument from silence because we don't know if anyone did contest it.
This is very interesting. In a clip that's about 25 seconds long, he both appeals to an argument from silence and criticizes arguments from silence. Let's take a closer look at this argument from silence. So let's look at the claim one more time, second line down on the right. And since we have no indication that anyone in the early church contested Papias's claim, we see no reason not to accept it. Now, regarding the argument from silence, I want to show you what two scholars have to say about this. The first quote is from Daniel Ulusi that you see on the top, and he, in his article, is not trying to argue against the Gospels originally being circulated anonymously. So his perspective is a bit different from the second scholar I'm going to show you. He says, given far-flung Christian groups spread across the Mediterranean, this unanimous agreement on the naming of the texts would constitute a Septuagint-esque miracle. It's a funny way of wording that. And then Simon Gathercole, who argues from a different perspective, says second century Christian literature is replete with references to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as authors of Gospels. And there is never any sense that the Gospels were anonymous or written by others. Now, I'm showing you two scholars who have two different approaches and different conclusions on this issue, but they both agree that this argument from silence is an important data point, namely that we don't have any competing traditions about who wrote the Gospels. But why shouldn't we dismiss this as simply an argument from silence that's irrelevant? Well, there are clearly degrees of arguments from silence. And so if someone comes to me and says that there's no archaeological evidence for the existence of Abraham, therefore Abraham didn't exist, that's a very weak argument from silence because we don't expect to find much evidence. But when we look at the early traditions about the authorship of the Gospels, and we see a stack of evidence on one side and then nothing on the other, that is a significant data point. It's a rather compelling argument from silence, as various scholars across the spectrum acknowledge. This clip begins at 38:06.
The picture of the disciples as cowardly, spiritually blind, and hard of heart is particularly vivid in Mark. This, it is held, points to an apostolic viewpoint, for only an apostle would have been able to criticize the 12 so harshly.
That
Okay,
is perhaps
That's just silly, man. That's just silly. Like this would not fly. This would never fly in the Hadith. This would never fly. We don't know who the source is, but he criticized the narrators. That means he must have been there, or he criticizes the characters in the event. Therefore, he must have been. It's just absolutely
He
absurd.
criticized the source, therefore he must have been there.
But he criticized the narrators. That means he must have been there.
Who is the he? Is that the author of Mark? Is that one of the apostles? And where is the there? And why is this relevant to the authorship of the Gospel of Mark? Let's go back to the quote. Carson and Moo are talking about the harsh criticism of the 12 that we see in the Gospel of Mark. And their only point is that this points to, as they say, they state their case modestly, this points to an apostle or an apostolic viewpoint, because who is more likely to criticize the 12? Some lowly scribe who's writing the gospel, or one of the 12? It seems that this criticism would come from someone in a higher position. That's their only point. And somehow that simple quote gets twisted into this.
We don't know who the source is, but he criticized the narrators. That means he must have been there.
We see this a lot, actually, very emotional responses, and they often overstate my arguments, creating a straw man and then responding to that straw man. Let's look at another example, starting at 39:44.
Now, Moo and Carson Carson suggest three other factors that point to Peter's influence in the Gospel of Mark. Peter figures prominently in Mark, and then citing Dodd, there's a pattern of the Gospel that's similar to Peter's words in Acts 10:36 through 41, and Mark is called my son in 1 Peter chapter 5.
Problems upon problems here. Okay, so he's given three evidences to prove that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark. Now, the first point he makes is that Peter figures prominently in Mark. Yes, he does. No one denies that. But him being an important figure could generally mean he was an important figure in the early church, and this person knew that fact. That does not mean merely because Peter was important that this somehow proves that the author of Mark knew Peter. On the second one, the pattern of the gospel similar to Peter's words in Acts chapter 10, verses 36 to 41. So the pattern of speaking is something, again, which is suggestive and indicative as opposed to determinative.
Notice what I said. Point to Peter's influence.
Now, Moo and Carson suggest three other factors that point to Peter's influence in the Gospel of Mark.
Point to Peter's influence.
The pattern of speaking is something, again, which is suggestive and indicative as opposed to determinative.
The pattern of speaking is something that's suggestive and indicative. But let's go back and listen to what I said.
Now, Moo and Carson suggest three other factors that point to Peter's influence in the Gospel of Mark.
And so when you compare the language that I use at the beginning of this clip with what Ijaz says later, it appears he agrees with me. So what does he disagree with? He disagrees with his own restatement of my argument, which is called a straw man.
He's given three evidences to prove that the Gospel of Mark was written by Mark.
So did I say prove? No, I didn't. I never used language that strong. I'm talking about the influence of Peter on the Gospel of Mark. Listen to what he says at the end.
So it does not actually follow through that because the pattern of speech is similar, that it means it's the same. In fact, it's of note that Colin does not flesh this point out.
It's actually not significant at all that I don't flesh that point out because my video is a survey of data relevant to the authorship and dating of the Gospel of Mark. That's all it is. It's not a video where I do literary analysis between two passages. And so Ijaz here is just trying to score some cheap points with his rhetoric. More cheap rhetoric and 43:13.
We have to keep in mind that there are layered assumptions that are being made to lead Colin to his viewpoint.
This is a frequent accusation that I use layered assumptions. However, this is not the case, and they would be more aware of this had they watched the introduction video that I produced on the authorship and dating of the Gospels. And there I use arguments from Greek syntax and from early manuscripts, as well as some practical considerations. And I also bring in, as Ijaz has noted, arguments from early church history. These are not later assumptions. These are multiple independent lines of evidence that converge at the same point. And if Ijaz disagrees, then the burden of proof is on him to demonstrate how I'm actually using layered assumptions instead of multiple independent lines of evidence. And so once again, these are just more rhetorical points. This clip starts at 50:43.
Blomberg, with a number of other scholars, puts the dating of Mark's Gospel sometime in the 60s. It is also important to observe that Irenaeus claims only that the transmission of the Gospel occurred after Peter's death, not necessarily its composition. But if Mark wrote during Peter's lifetime, and if the early church tradition can be trusted that Peter was martyred under Nero before AD 68, then Mark must have composed his gospel at some still earlier date, perhaps 64 to 65, when Nero's persecution was beginning.
So this is actually not evidential of anything. This is a person theorizing of what we would call the terminus postquem, the earliest date from which this gospel could have originated.
Pay attention to that. The earliest date from which this gospel could have originated. Keep that in mind, the earliest date.
So I think Colin uses this to say that it can be the origin of this gospel is at that point in time, whereas what Craig Blomberg mentions here is that it could have been or must have been composed at some earlier date. And he specifies that the composition could have begun between 64 to 65. You would notice that the first line, the first sentence, the second line, not necessarily its composition, but rather that which was published at some other point in time. So it seems as if Colin does not understand the context of the quote.
Okay, so you have three dates on your screen, AD 68, 64, and 65. Which one is Ijaz talking about? Which is the early date that he's talking about? He doesn't say. So let's work through each one of them. Could it be AD 68? No, because the context of Blomberg's quote is referring to the Gospel of Mark being written during Peter's lifetime. And I think we can all agree that the Gospel of Mark could not have been written during Peter's lifetime after Peter was martyred, which was by AD 68. So AD 68 can't be the date that Ijaz is referring to. What about AD 64 or 65? Well, a couple of paragraphs later in his commentary, Blomberg says, when we come to the introduction of Luke, we will see that a plausible case can be made for dating his gospel to about AD 62. This, therefore, would require Mark to have been written earlier still, though perhaps by only a year or two. So there, Blomberg is talking about Mark being written even earlier than 64 or 65. So no matter which date you use,
The earliest date from which this gospel could have originated.
Ijaz is wrong. But once again, what we have here are rhetorical games. This video begins at 30:33.
So there's a book by Professor Marcus Buckmule, Simon Peter in Scripture and Memory. And within the very first page, the very first paragraph, I believe he mentions that the search for the historical Peter runs swiftly into the ground.
So let's look at the quote from Marcus Buckmule. Any conventional quest for a historical Peter runs into the ground rather swiftly. What is a conventional quest? Buckmule explains this was the classic conception of Old Testament and New Testament study at the beginning of the 20th century. The real Bible lies buried beneath a strata of centuries of tradition and interpretation, and it is historical criticism's task to recover it. But for all the well-intentioned concern for dispassionate objectivity, it also began to dawn on thoughtful scholars during the last century that the more we keep deconstructing our sources, the taller our speculations become, and the more we are in danger of finding in them mainly ourselves and our view of the world. So Marcus Buckmule is critiquing a certain type of scholarship, this conventional scholarship. He says, but the recollection of the apostles too soon becomes a topic of explicit reflection. Especially in later New Testament books, readers are frequently urged to call to mind the apostles, initially in their absence, but also and increasingly after their death. As a matter of fact, the claims of living apostolic memory continued, surprisingly, for many decades, an observation that runs against ingrained assumptions of much conventional, historical, critical scholarship of early Christianity. And there we have it, conventional, historical, critical scholarship. Let's go back to our original quote. Any conventional quest for a historical Peter runs into the ground rather swiftly. So now we know what the conventional quest means. It means a conventional, historical, critical quest. Now, the presuppositions of this methodology of scholarship go against both Christianity and Islam. And they also go against Marcus Buckmule's goal in this book. Notice the title, Simon Peter in Scripture and what? And memory. What does he talk about down here? As a matter of fact, the claims of the living apostolic memory continued. And this observation goes against ingrained assumptions. And so he criticizes this convention, the historical critical methodology, for its shortcomings. And he lets us know in the title of the book itself that he's going to expand his search beyond that. Now, historical critical methodology has presuppositions that go against both Islam and Christianity. I have no idea why Ijaz is appealing to this conventional methodology. He doesn't accept it for his own worldview, neither do any Muslims, and Christians don't either. It doesn't really do any good to describe the presuppositions to you, so let me just give you kind of the end result of this type of scholarship. You have things like the similarity of events, correlation, and a closed universe. And so what ends up happening is that every event is seen in this historical critical methodology to be cause and effect. And so you go all the way back, the continuum of human history, and what you have is cause and effect, cause and effect, cause and effect, and that's it. And there's no transcendent cause. So if we adopt this historical critical methodology, if Ijaz does, he has to reject the notion, for example, that Allah revealed the Quran to Muhammad, because that's transcendent, and there's no room for that in this historical critical scholarship that Marcus Buckmule is describing. And so Ijaz is apparently unaware of what this conventional methodology refers to, or he is comfortable with being inconsistent enough to give Christians the result of the conventional search for the historical Peter. However, he will not apply this methodology to his own religion, because if he did, all we would need to do is substitute Muhammad for Peter. And then we would say that the conventional quest for the historical Muhammad runs swiftly into the ground. The conventional quest for the historical Uthman runs swiftly into the ground, and so forth. On and on we could go. But he rejects those presuppositions, and so do Christians. So why is he trying to apply them in the context of the historical Peter? 4246, Farid asks a question.
How about some of the attributions to Peter are correct?
They could potentially be, but then again, even the authorship of Acts itself is very disputed.
What about some of these attributions of Peter? And Ijaz's response is the authorship of Acts. Absolutely nothing to do with Farid's question, but Ijaz just uses it to try to score some more rhetorical points. He uses his question, Farid's question, to give a completely unrelated response on the authorship of Acts. Okay, this next set of clips is from 1645, 1905, 4754, and 4817.
You will see that Tertullian is writing towards the latter half of the 2nd century, maybe early half of the 3rd century. Just because the church, and this is not early, by the way, early would be contemporaneous, early would be contemporaneous, early would be contemporaneous. This is
Right.
early in comparison to the fact that they have nothing early.
Right.
Right? It's problems here again. Just because the early tradition says that they got it from the disciples, which they don't necessarily say so, does not mean that the early tradition came from the disciples themselves. So if the authors were the disciples, or they knew the disciples, then they should have been able to say, as the church fathers shortly thereafter.
So notice what he's doing. He doesn't want Christians to be able to say we have any early traditions. And so he redefines early to mean contemporaneous.
Early would be contemporaneous.
So we don't have the early church fathers, we have the contemporaneous church fathers, but the contemporaneous church fathers are called the apostles. They already have a name. So then we have the apostles / the contemporary / early church fathers. And then we move down the line to what?
As the church fathers shortly thereafter.
The shortly thereafter fathers. So we have the contemporaneous early church fathers, which are the apostles, and then we have the shortly thereafter church fathers. And so we can see that all he's doing here is playing word games. He doesn't want to use early, but he does acknowledge that we do have early sources, and this comes out occasionally in Freudian slips.
Does not mean that the early tradition, the church fathers shortly thereafter, early tradition shortly thereafter.
Papias and Eusebius, 703 and 2106.
Right.
Eusebius himself in Church History, Book 3, Chapter 39, actually spells out that Papias is a person who believes wondrous things which are inaccurate.
And is there a reason to assume that Eusebius may have made this up, or that he's unreliable?
So Eusebius himself does say that it is okay to lie for the sake of the gospel. He actually uses the word agato sudistai, a good lie. So as long as the lie brings someone to believe, quote unquote, in the truth, it's okay to lie in that sense. And he actually quotes Plato in order to justify this claim.
In the book The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, Gary Habermas and Mike Licona have a thorough end note that addresses this issue. When Eusebius refers to falsehood, he is not encouraging Christians to lie for the benefit of the kingdom of Christ. Reason number one. In his comparison with the Hebrew scriptures, he states that thousands of passages similar to Plato's can be found. He then lists a few examples of human passions attributed to God that he claims are adopted for the benefit of those who need this mode of instruction. These are Jewish reasons why one should live the righteous life. The result is that those who are not naturally inclined to live righteously may be encouraged to do so for fear of the consequences. Writers of the Old Testament obviously believed such consequences were real. So in Eusebius's comparison of Plato to the Hebrew scriptures, he is saying that Plato copied the idea from them, that certain devices that do not exactly reflect reality may be used to persuade to live righteously. The Hebrew writers attributed human qualities to God to explain why we should not worship other gods and the reasons behind other laws. Plato copied this principle, says Eusebius, when he wrote that he presented the truth for why men should be moral, because a moral life makes one happier than an immoral one. However, Plato continues, Even if he is mistaken and evil men comply, the goal of a moral society is obtained. Number 2, the Hebrew and Christian scriptures never encourage one to lie. In fact, quite the opposite is true, and then he gives some examples. Number 3, a similar section is found in Eusebius's sequel, Proof of the Gospel, about lying to bring people into the kingdom of Christ. However, Eusebius is speaking in a very sarcastic tone and context, clearly intending his readers to understand that such is preposterous. Therefore, there is no reason to believe he would encourage just the opposite in this related writing. Further, Eusebius's examples of anthropopatheia or anthropomorphisms indicate that he saw the value in offering reasons why one should be righteous, namely that this may motivate those to be righteous who would not normally be inclined to do so. God may not sleep or experience jealousy as humans do, but these figures of speech, good lies, motivate people to live righteously. Thus, Eusebius has demonstrated how the Greeks have borrowed from the older Hebrew, which is the intent of the passage. The assertion that Eusebius encouraged deceit should be rejected. At the very least, his solitary statement cannot be taken as having proved this to be his meaning. But the question in context that Farid is asking is more about Eusebius quoting his sources, not what Eusebius says about the gospel or the Christian faith. And what Eusebius scholars have noted is that Eusebius does quote his sources accurately where we can check them. He quotes them accurately. However, he does want to steer his readers in a particular direction. And so, for example, he quotes Papias accurately. As far as we can tell, what Papias says about Matthew and Mark is repeated in Irenaeus. And so he quotes Papias. However, he doesn't want his readers to go with some of Papias's doctrine. So he criticizes Papias at the same time. So he quotes his sources, but he does try to steer his readers in a direction. And this is why we see him criticizing Papias as not being too sharp. This clip starts at 33:23.
So everyone generally believes that the gospel is homonymous. That's a form of anonymity, meaning it's just a popular name used at that time.
Okay.
And this is the standard position.
When Ijaz says everyone generally believes this or that, we have to look at the actual claim that he's making. So here's a quote from Simon Gathercole. The canonical gospels are usually classed very much on the more anonymous side. But surprisingly, this apparent anonymity of the Gospels has received relatively little scholarly attention. And Daniel Ulucci, that we heard from earlier, says the standard critical model is far shakier than many imagine. And so it's not just a matter of saying everyone believes this or all scholars believe this. We have to actually look at how many scholars have specifically studied the issue themselves and how many are simply jumping on board with what may be a mainstream view. Gathercole continues, the apparent anonymity of the Gospels is a neglected topic in New Testament studies. The main body of the argument is in two parts. First, anonymity cannot be inferred from an absence of authorial self-reference in the body of the work, and therefore the argument that the Gospels are anonymous because they do not contain the author's names is invalid, and I have in brackets why, and we'll see why later. Secondly, and more positively, while the titles contained in the earliest Gospel manuscripts may well in their present form be secondary, this does not exclude earlier attributions of authorship made in some other way. Practical considerations make the presence of the author's names very likely. Second-century Christian literature is replete with references to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as authors of Gospels, and there is never any sense that the Gospels were anonymous or written by others. The most likely conclusion to be drawn is that the attributions of authorship are original. But I do want to stress that it's not just as simple as looking at manuscripts, as we saw earlier. Gathercole is quoting Simon Swain here. He says, it is perfectly normal for literary works to begin without a reference to their author. The author's name should already be known to the reader or hearer from the usual devices. There's much more, but we might as well end where we began, with the titles of the Gospels. In summary then, we've seen overstatements, strawman fallacies, and non sequiturs. We've seen incomplete engagement. They presented part of my arguments to their audience as if they were the whole of my arguments. And we've seen their methodology at work, striving toward what I call vague agnosticism. Striving toward vague agnosticism, that's the goal. Whatever conclusion Ijaz ends at, it's just agnosticism. He wants to be able to say, we don't know about all of these issues surrounding the New Testament and the Bible as a whole. Once again, this shouldn't be surprising. This is where Ehrman ends up, and Ijaz is nothing more than a popular level Ehrman. I have Peter down there as a specific example. He's even willing to adopt historical, critical presuppositions and import them into his argument against Peter against the reliability of characters in the New Testament. And I also have titles as an example. Once again, he's willing to disregard all of the manuscripts with titles and point to P1, which is fragmentary, as evidence to contradict D.A. Carson and Doug Moo. And so his methodology, strive toward agnosticism. Always find something that you can use to say that we don't know. Apply skepticism as necessary, ignoring consistencies ad infinitum. And we talked about this with early sources and Eusebius and his quote about lies. And we've seen how that works today. We don't know who wrote Mark. And even if we did know that Mark wrote Mark, we wouldn't know which Mark we were talking about. And yes, there's a mention of a Mark. Throughout the New Testament, he travels, it seems, in the apostolic circles, but we can't really be sure of anything because we don't know who wrote the book of Acts. And yes, this Mark is mentioned in 1 Peter, but we don't know who this Peter guy is anyway, especially if we apply historical critical presuppositions to the question. But then we move into the church fathers. They do say some relevant things like Papias, but then we can use Eusebius to dismiss Papias. And after we use Eusebius to dismiss Papias, we can use Eusebius to dismiss himself. And so any barrier of evidence that Ijaz runs into, he just raises that level of skepticism high enough to get over it. My favorite clip of all.
Is this overwhelming you, the information? You thought it was better than this, like this?
It's not overwhelming me, but I'm assuming it's going to be overwhelming him if he watches this, and I'm sure he will.
Overwhelmed. Not quite. I spend all of my time in academic literature, and watching a 1-hour discussion between Farid and Ijaz is a gigantic step down. And so here we see the difference between the level of material Farid thinks he's putting out and the level of material that he actually is putting out. All right, why I won't do any more response videos. They are, as I said, a gigantic step down. They're also not a wise use of my time. If you have 1 hour and you're going to read a journal article or watch a video on Farid Responds, which one do you think is more intellectually stimulating? And predictable methodology. That is, they're just popular level Bart Ehrmans. And all you're going to see them do when they interact with these topics is drive toward vague agnosticism. That's what they want to get to. They don't have any alternative explanations. They just, at the end of the day, want to be able to say, I don't know. And since I don't know, you can't know either. And audiences. When you go to the comment sections of these response channels, they appear to me to be people who simply want to hear things that confirm what they already believe. And so I can't justify using my time to produce content for people who don't want to hear it anyway. And so I must choose to use my limited time in a more productive way. First response video, last response video. Let's get on to some things that are more productive, and I'll see you next time.